Hello, friends. Wow. What an amazing group of people. What amazing voices, all joined together here on this day. Thank you for being here. I'm honored to have been invited today to introduce Reverend Barber. On my way here, I actually drove to Toledo from visiting some friends of mine in Baltimore. We visited our capital of our nation, Washington, D.C., on the 4th of July, on Independence Day. I was reminded of some of the key tenets of our nation. When you're in a place like that, especially in a time like this, sometimes you have to ignore the individuals who may be in positions of power today and think about the context in which we now sit. On my way here, I wanted to listen to some of Reverend Barber's speeches just to get my juices flowing. And boy, did they get my juices flowing. The theme that I want to echo today from Reverend Barber's speeches is one of unity. One of the things that he said that resonates with me the most is the idea that it's not just about one president. It's not just about one group of people in power right now. If we don't understand the context that we're living in today, then we can't move forward. And if we don't understand that our struggle is shared, whether you are fighting for environmental justice or whether you are fighting for equity, whether you are fighting for racial equality, or whether you are fighting for access to public education, our fight is the same. And it is that concept that those that are in power want us to forget. It is that concept that they want us to ignore. It is that concept that they try hard every day on Twitter and on Facebook, in the media, and whenever they have an opportunity. They try hard to remind us of our differences instead of that which unites us. And the power of what Reverend Barber speaks of is the power of unity, the power of those who can come together and say enough is enough. It's time for change. And that's why I'm so proud that as a state legislator, I got to witness some of the Poor People's Campaign Days of Action. To all those that were participated in the Poor People's Campaign, give yourselves a round of applause. Now, I know Reverend Barber just wrapped up 40 days of the Poor People's Campaign. 40 days of action. 40 days of action that made an impact on this country. And I know that he's been arrested already 6 times with others. He's put himself on the line. He's put himself forward just as many of you have. I've been inspired by the words of Reverend Barber. I've been inspired and I continue to be inspired, and I think today we are all honored by his presence. And I hope that we will all be inspired by his words. Inspired to not give up. Because that's what they want. They want us to look at our differences and to divide ourselves among religious lines and racial lines. They want us to divide the environmentalists and the labor movement. They want us to divide up into all our little chunks so that we can't be unified, so that we can't speak with a greater voice. Are we going to let them do that? I didn't think so. So now, in our great Quaker tradition, by the way, thank you, Claire, for that great introduction, and Paul for all of your great work. I've been a member of Ann Arbor Friends Meeting, or a attender at Ann Arbor Friends Meeting since middle school, since 2001, and it has provided to me a space to go and a family to be with. And so in the tradition of those meetings, in the tradition of our Quaker meetings, I would ask that we all engage in silence as Reverend Barber comes up to the podium, let us take silence and think about his words. Let us think about his movement. Let us think about the Poor People's Campaign and all that we have done together in this room to make our country a better place. Thank you.
Our brothers and sisters are sleeping on the street. For a country this rich to have so many people poor, it's immoral and it's wrong.
Our backs are against the wall, and we got no choice but to push.
As well as that breaking news in Albany, where a large group of protesters have moved into the street.
Washington Avenue between City Hall and Larch Street closed down.
Protesters with the Poor People's Campaign of Indiana.
2 o'clock on the East Coast, 2 o'clock in the middle, 2 o'clock on the West Coast. A wave of historians tell us this never happened.
Our communities, Muslim communities, who have joined the Poor People's Campaign, you can count on us.
Our democracy is in trouble. Our democracy is in trouble. And we come to demand.
Because it's crucial that we make ourselves heard. No one is listening. We write letters, we make calls. No one is listening. So we gotta find a way to make ourselves heard.
We are the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And we are here. We are poor. We are burdened. And we're here to say to our nation's capital and to the highest court of this land that everybody has a right to live. Everybody has a right to learn. Everybody has a right to love. Everybody has a right to live choices. Everybody has a right to vote. Everybody has a right to thrive in this society.
And the clergy, we read Article 6 of the Kentucky State Constitution. They said we have a right to free assembly.
We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
There will be a movement that will break through the calm and bring people together
To save the heart and the soul of this democracy and this world.
Gracious Spirit and gracious God, we thank you now for the privilege to even stand and to serve the cause of justice and love and mercy. We know from your word that whenever you call men and women to attempt to say anything on your behalf, you take the risk of putting treasure in an earthen vessel, easily broken and easily blown away. But you do it so that when the miracle of your message comes to us, the excellency of it will all be given to your name. So hold us, hide us, and help us, we ask. In the name of all that is divine, amen. Sometimes it's hard for me to hear that tape, certainly to look at it, because I think about all of the deep pain and problems in this nation, but I also think about all of the courageous people that are coming together around the country. I am, there's some echo in this, I'm more than honored to be here tonight. I'm deeply humbled. My father used to take me to Quaker meetings when I was young. My grandfather was part of the Church of the Nazarene. I was born 1963 in Indianapolis, Indiana. So anytime a Hoosier can come to Buckeye country, that is somewhat of a miracle. And it's always good to come back to these parts. I'm so thankful to Barry Crossnow, the General Secretary, staff, and I believe many, many volunteers who are making this happen. I can use the hand mic if I need to. And to Carolyn, who's been so good, so gracious, so kind. She's been coordinating with Miss Charmaine Fletcher. And, you know, they snuck down to the church that I pastored in Goldsboro, her and her wife, and they were there, and we sung a little love song. And I understand now they've adopted the love song. And to this guy that had the nerve to try to draw this portrait over here, where's he at? I don't know if I ought to thank him or point him out. I want to make sure I know exactly where he is. If you could bring it up, there he is, give him a hand. Bring it up just a little bit so I can balance. You want me to use? So I'm going to pause. You want me to use the hand or this one? The podium mic is the best one. Can you bring it up just a tad so I can, just to take the echo? I believe in getting things. There we go, now. All right. I want to ask you all to write this number down or memorize it, 90975, and to text ACTION to that number, 90975, and to remember www.breachrepairers.org, because the 40 days for the Poor People Campaign was a launch. It was a commencing, not a commencement. Brother Youssef, thank you so much for your kind introduction. It was a commencement. And now we have 40 coordinating committees in 40 states. Where are people in the coordinating from Ohio? Any people in here from Ohio or other states that were part of Poor People Just Raised? And we're building now, moving into the second stage. I'll talk some about that later. But it's important for us to have a long-term movement and not to just have a moment or just one march. And so I want you to 90975. Now, there is a scriptural text in the book of Ezekiel. And in the Message Bible, it reads thusly. Verse 26, chapter 22. Your priest violated my law and desecrated my holy things. They can't tell the difference between the sacred and the secular. They tell people there's no difference between right and wrong. They are contemptuous of my holy Sabbath. They profane me by trying to pull me down to your level. And because of this, your politicians are now like wolves, prowling and killing rapturously, taking whatever they want. And your preachers cover up for the politicians by pretending to have received visions and special revelations. They say, this is what God the Master says, when God hasn't said so much as one word. They aren't listening to God, they're listening to their own ego. And because of that, extortion is rife, robbery is epidemic, the poor and the needy are abused, and the undocumented and outsiders and immigrants are kicked around at will with no access for justice. So God said to Ezekiel, I looked for someone to stand up for me against all of this. I looked for somebody that would repair the defenses of the city, would take a stand for me and stand in the gap to protect the land and to protect the vulnerable, so I wouldn't have to destroy it. And I couldn't find anyone, Ezekiel. No, not one. I want to talk for a minute this evening. America must have a moral witness in this moment. Not as a Democratic witness, not a Republican witness, but a moral witness in this moment. Sometimes I believe that Ezekiel the prophet was the first Quaker. Really. Because in the first chapter of Ezekiel, the first thing God tells him to do is shut up. He says, Ezekiel, I want you laying on the ground quiet for 7 days. I don't want you to say a word. 7 days, 7 movements of time. I don't want you to say a thing. I want you to hear. I want you to hear the cries of the people. I want you to hear me groaning. Because you're about to deal with some stiff-necked people. And I want you to be quiet until you have the authority to speak. That was Ezekiel. And God literally tells Ezekiel, you have no authority to speak until you have fully listened at what is going on around you. I think right now a lot of people are doing a lot of talking, but they have not listened and done the analysis of the moment we're in. This is no normal political moment. Ezekiel was called to be a moral witness in extraordinarily dangerous and divisive times. In the text that we read, which is 22 chapters into Ezekiel, it is made clear that society was on a very downward and immoral path. Ezekiel lived in the time of mean politics. He lived in the midst of a time where there was misuse of the court systems that was providing injustice as opposed to justice. He lived in a time when there was the misdirection of the mass communication of his day. People were being pushed to focus on all the wrong things. And he lived in a time where there was a malpractice of theology, distorting the very call and the very will of God. And as I stand here today, amidst all of you whose faith tradition is formed and shaped by that which we call Quaker, as we gather in the state of Ohio, so renowned as a place where slaves sought to come for freedom, a place where the slaves dreamed to climb those 100 steps up the banks of the Ohio River, a place where oftentimes when the slaves were singing, "Swing low, sweet chariot, come in for to carry me home," they were talking about Ohio. If I can just get halfway across the Ohio River, because you know the river was split. If you had to get halfway in a foot across the Ohio River to be free. Either Ohio was going to be home, or either Ohio was going to be the place through which you could move through the further underground railroad to get to Canada. But as I come here today, I can't help but think about two of my heroes, one a shero and one a hero, Lucretia Mott and Levi Coffin from my home state of North Carolina. Both born in difficult, divisive, and dangerous times. Both born and lived prior to and after the Civil War. Both lived in a time when there was a meanness in politics. The political structures had legalized chattel slavery, legalized the dehumanization of a whole people, legalized the genocide of indigenous native people, legalized the brutal enslavement of black people. That's why Sessions was so wrong the other day when he tried to quote a scripture and say you're just supposed to follow whatever government has legalized regardless. Mott and Coffin were born at a time that had legalized the chauvinistic oppression of women. Both Mott and Coffin lived in a time when the courts were misused to sanction injustice. The courts were misused. For instance, in 1957, to declare that black people had no rights to which white people had to respect. That was in the Dred Scott decision. That came from the courts. And the courts also said that women had no voice or vote. And neither did the poor, those that didn't own land, particularly white males. Both Mott and Coffin lived in a time when the mass communication was being misdirected by the power brokers. The slave aristocracy promulgated more about the fear of slave revolts than the need to free the slave. That's the misdirection of mass communication. And both Mott and Coffin lived in a time when there was great malpractice in theology and religion. Religion was used to justify slavery. Misinterpretation of religion were used to justify violence against the slaves. Religion was used during the time of Mott and Coffin to justify snatching children from the breast of their mamas and selling them on the auction block. Theological malpractice was used to justify the suppression of women. And like Ezekiel of the Old Testament, Lucretia Mott and Levi Coffin received a call from the divine. The inner light was ablaze in them and told them to stand up, speak up as moral witnesses, even if it cost them their wealth and their lives. And so in the face of meanness in politics, misdirection of the media, misuse of the court, the malpractice of theology, Levi Coffin said, I thought it was always safe to do right. And that the Bible, in bidding us to free the hungry and clothe the naked, said nothing about color. And I should try to follow out the teachings of this good book no matter what. It was in the face of meanness and misdirection and misuse and malpractice in her time that Lucretia Mott said, any great change must expect opposition because it shakes the very foundation of privilege. She also proclaimed the only means I know of appointed by God in any age of the world is the faithfulness of his children, the obedience of those who are sent, the sons of him in every age, the messiahs of their age, who have gone forth proclaiming greater liberty, greater truths to mankind, greater duty for that entire community. And yes, though they may be few in number comparatively, though they may be weak in force comparatively, it has been said, and they may, and it be said again, I have chosen the weak things to confound the strong and the wise. That is why Lucretia Mott, when they had burned down the Quaker Meeting House in Philadelphia and were headed to her house, she did not run, but she stood flat-footed and challenged the system of slavery. But there's something else about Mott and Coffin. Both of them, along with others, but both of them refused to bifurcate their moral witness. You see, both of them challenged the suppression of women's rights. Both challenged slavery and all of its violence and inhumanity. And both challenged a society that rendered so many people poor. They understood that a moral witness is always a fusion witness. It is a witness that challenges injustices in all of its form, recognizing long before Dr. King ever said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so Mott walked right up in the anti-slavery meeting where all the menfolk were and said, oh no. And Levi Coffin took his seat right beside her and said, oh no. They said if you're going to fight against slavery, you also have to fight for women's rights. If you're going to fight against women's rights and slavery, you also have to fight against poverty, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so, in Ezekiel's day, he chose to accept the calling to be a moral witness and to stand in the gap, because when he stood in the gap, later on God would use his standing to raise up an army from the valley of dry bones. Lucretia Mott and Levi Coffin chose to accept the divine calling to be moral witnesses of their day, and because they did, the Underground Railroad was born, and an abolition movement was born, and slavery was ended. And the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution were written, particularly the 14th Amendment that redeemed the Constitution. Because without the 14th Amendment that provides equal protection under the law to every person, not every citizen, then the American Constitution was deeply flawed. Because they stood, they cut open a pathway to women's suffrage, and the right to vote was created. And they did not stand because being a moral witness was safe. They didn't stand because it was secure, and they didn't stand because it was guaranteed success. They didn't poll their morality to find out which issue was popular. They stood because the moment required a moral witness. And I come today to say that in America, today, once again, we need a moral witness. 2018 is the anniversary of two movements that were begun. One was the Poor People's Campaign, when Dr. King and others, including Quakers, saw that the only thing that would keep America from descending into a political hell would be to simultaneously address militarism, racism, and poverty. And so for more than 1 year, after the speech at Riverside in April of 1967, Dr. King talked exclusively almost about what he called two Americas. One America was flowed with milk and honey and flowed with opportunity and prosperity. The other America flowed with poverty, ugliness, depression, disease, lack of education, and death. And he knew that a house divided against itself could not stand. He declared that America needed a new and unsettling force, that poor people and people of faith needed to come together. And he began with organizing the poor people and clergy and others who would demand transformation. Now, that movement did not end. Don't ever believe those who tell you the Poor People's Campaign movement ended. It was killed. It was assassinated. Martin's vertebrae severed in two when he was shot with a deer rifle, a 30-06 through the jaw, and he never spoke another word. Kennedy, killed. The movement was killed. Many others were killed. That's why that movement ended. And it was, and the answer to America being the America it has promised was right there. And it was assassinated. Now, at that moment, when that movement was being killed, another one was being born. That movement was called the Southern Strategy. It was designed by Kevin Phillips and Richard Nixon. And the goal in 1968 was to develop a movement that would control the nation's politics for the next 50 years. This is the 50th year. It would control the nation's politics by creating a platform that would lock up all the votes in the southern states, the states in the wheat belt, and the states in the so-called rust belt, and in like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, or at least up in the Pittsburgh area, and certainly the ethnic enclaves of the North. And here was what was born 50 years ago. The goal would be to denounce anti-poverty programs, declare that they were a waste of money, and to racialize those poverty programs as a way to pit white, poor, and low-income workers against African-American and Latino poor and low-income workers. Because Kevin Phillips said, all you have to do, Mr. Nixon, is find out who you can make hate who. And we can control the politics of this country for the next 50 years. They seeded the lie that anti-poverty programs were causing the detriment of white, poor, and low-income people by forcing them to pay taxes into these programs that were only helping lazy people. They didn't use the N-word because they found out from George Wallace that wouldn't work. So lazy became a new code word for black and brown. And the very people who needed to be allies, poor white folk and poor black folk and poor brown folk, were pitted against one another. The goal of the movement was to create fear and hatred so that the Republican Party would not be about a party, really, because my granddad was a Republican, so a lot of folk today that call themselves Republican, they aren't Republican. It's some hybrid something. The goal of it was to become the party of primarily white people and the former Dixiecrat segregationists of the South and of the North. Tax cuts would be the primary language because that sounds economic. It doesn't sound racial. But what we know when we study Nobel Peace Prize economists like Joseph Stiglitz, that tax cuts have deep racial implications. And states' rights would be their language. Rolling back voting rights, rolling back civil rights, rolling back women's rights would be the goal of this movement. Taking over the court systems and state houses would be the goals of this movement. And creating a hold on enough states, this was the goal, to create the hold on enough states that even if an extremist candidate lost the popular vote, they could still win the Electoral College and win the presidency of the United States. That was the plan set in motion 50 years ago. It was used by Richard Nixon. It was perfected by Ronald Reagan. It was the backdrop of how George W. Bush won without winning the popular vote. And now it has been taken to its most extreme conclusion with Donald Trump. You see, that's why you have to understand Donald Trump is really not the problem. A professor at Princeton University said he is the iconography of a too familiar call and response in the American project. We move toward justice a little bit, and then there is a backlash. Obama's election was moving us forward with a little justice. We don't agree with everything Obama did. I didn't. But the coming together of people from all different races and colors was a movement toward a little bit of justice. Affordable Care Act, a little more justice. Raising wages in the federal government, a little more justice. Appointing 2 women to the Supreme Court and 1 a Latino, a little more justice. The Department of Justice defending rights and fighting against voter suppression, a little more justice. And then in 2010, actually the night before he was even inaugurated, but in 2010, the backlash began in earnest. And 23 states in 2010 initiated voter suppression plans, racial gerrymandering plan, designed using the platform of the Southern strategy with a few tweaks for the 21st century. And it was designed to take over the Congress and to block anything that was progressive. And then, during that period, before Trump was ever on the ballot, he went all over the country, speaking tours all over the country. He used The Apprentice to get, to get a little name, and the media would call him all the time to talk. He was slowly just getting his name. He runs for office. He runs on racism and Islamophobia. But it's a particular kind of racism he runs on, targeted at Mexicans. But if you know anything about white nationalism believes that the first proxy war that white nationalists have to win today is against immigration. That's what Richard Spencer, the white nationalist, has actually said. And he runs on racism and Islamophobia, and his party doesn't question. He runs on tax cut. They don't question, they don't critique, because he uses the white Southern strategy that was developed in 1968. He claimed economic fears and immigration fears. And so between Russian involvement under the table and voter suppression on top of the table, the fix is in. He knows he can't win the popular vote, but the goal was never to win the popular vote. The goal was the goal of the Southern strategy, to lock up the Electoral College, which by its way has its roots in racism, has its roots in a compromise that was made with the slave states over slavery and representation, the 3/5 compromise. Every state that was necessary to get him to 270 electoral votes had done voter suppression since 2010 before he was ever on the ballot. He loses the election. Don't ever say he won the election. He loses the election by 3 million votes and wins the Electoral College by less than 780,000 votes in 3 states that gave him the Electoral College victories in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and places like Ohio. Thousands of votes were suppressed in Wisconsin. For instance, he wins the Electoral College for Wisconsin by 30,000 votes. There were 250,000 votes suppressed in Wisconsin. He controlled from Maryland to Texas. That's the old Confederacy. If you control from Maryland to Texas, that's over 180 electoral votes just in those 13 states. Which means you only need just another 80 or so out of the other 37 states to win. Now, Democrats didn't help themselves. We have to be honest. They didn't take on racism. They didn't speak forcefully enough about it. We had 26 presidential debates and not one debate, not 1 hour on racism. I mean, you do know that Roseanne Barr saying something crazy ain't racism. That's just crazy. Racism, systemic racism, is policy. Racism is voter suppression. Racism is blocking immigrants from justice. That's racism. But you didn't hear one debate on racism. You didn't have one debate on voter suppression. You didn't have one debate on poverty. And Democrats didn't know how to unify. I wonder what would have happened if Hillary and Bernie would have combined voices and not taken for granted this Trump stuff. Right? They thought they could run a campaign that didn't require running in every state. Democrats said, we're going to win by going to this state and that state and this state and this state. That didn't work. They didn't come in the South. Just let the South go. Over $10 billion was spent in the election. Senator McConnell blocked Obama's nomination for the Supreme Court in a way we hadn't seen since the Civil War, and we ended up in America with a president steeped in racism, narcissism, economic isolation, and we ended up with a majority Congress so paid off by their corporate backers that they would sell their own children's future out to give a tax cut to the wealthy, guns to the NRA, freedom to the insurance companies, deregulation to the polluters, and the right to oppress workers to the corporation, and more money, more money, more money to the military defense contractor and the war economy. That's where we are. That's the analysis. Here we are at a time we are saying in the Poor People's Campaign, where once again, like Dr. King said, we have to address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism if we're going to turn this country around. And you can't separate any one of those from the other. Why do I say that? Because systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and the false moral narrative of Christian nationalism has created a kind of meanness in politics. Like in Ezekiel's day, like in Lucretia Mar's, meanness in politics. A meanness we haven't seen as overt for a long time. Now, I'm not trying to suggest the meanness just showed up. Meanness is a part of the American project too. Just like having a racist president didn't just begin with Trump. Woodrow Wilson was racist. Huh? Woodrow Wilson played Birth of a Nation, in the Oval Office 100 years before Bannon was ever on Trump's staff. Woodrow Rutherford B. Hayes lost the popular vote and won the electoral college in 1877, I think the year Coffin died, in 1877. And when he won, he turned the South back over to the racists and turned the courts over to the extremists. And by 1883, all of the gains between 1868 and 1877 had been turned around, even the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And and you don't have to go back that far. Racism and meanness is not new, but there's this meanness, it's a boldness about it. When a Congress refuses to restore the protections of the voting rights, that's why I couldn't get happy yesterday at so-called July 4th. I was reading Frederick Douglass. Bombast, fraud. Because here we are. Do you realize on June 25th, 2013, the Supreme Court, 5 members of the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And for 5 years, this Congress under McConnell and Ryan have had the opportunity to fix it, and they've refused not to. Now watch this. We call Strom Thurmond a racist. Strom Thurmond only filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 57 for 1 day. Ryan and McConnell have filibustered fixing the Voting Rights Act for 5 years. That is not just Republican or Democrat. That's just mean. That's mean. Especially when you realize that people died for the right to vote, black and white. When Ohio says, we want to be able to purge voters. You ever heard such a purge voter? If somebody chooses not to vote, we want to be able to take them off the roll. That's just mean. When politicians, some of them wake up every morning and say, today, I'm so glad to be alive so I can find out how many people I can take off health care. That's just mean. Mean. How many people can I let die today? Since for every 1 million people that do not have health care, 5,600 die. When politicians get up and say, you know what, the best thing is for us to give more welfare to the corporation of wealthy and ignore 140 million poor and low-income people in this country. There's not 39 million, it's 140 million people who are poor and low wealth. 73% of them are women and children. 140 million people, that's 43.5% of the total population of the United States of America in the 21st century. 13 million of them are children. The majority are white women, the disabled, and children. And 250,000 people, according to various schools of public policy, die. 250,000 people die every year from poverty and the lack of a basic income. And when you can see that and know that, but all you care about is a tax cut to the wealthy, that's just mean. 62 million people in this country work every day for less than a living wage. There's not a place in this country where working for minimum wage you can afford a basic apartment. And now we have people saying, guess what we want to do? Since we cut the budget and now we have to figure out a way to make it up so we won't have such a deficit, let's cut $17 billion from food stamps. Let's roll back health care, the CHIPS program for children. Let's cut $7 billion from public education. My friends, you don't call that the right. Don't call that conservative. Don't even call that Republican. That's just mean. When you put $600 billion in war, 2 times more than we spent doing Vietnam per year, we spend 53 cents of every discretion dollar in military war and militarism, and only 15 cents of every dollar programs to help uplift the poor. And when defense contractors are making a killing off of killing, the average defense contractor makes $19 million a year, the average CEO, while the average combat soldier makes less than $30,000, and they say they love the soldiers. And we promulgate war, continue wars like the war in Afghanistan that we know we can't win, but they don't want to lose the money. That's not conservative. That's not Republican. That's not, that's just mean. And when a party and an attorney general with the blessings of the president, the silence of the Congress and the silence of all of these so-called preachers that claim them to be, quote unquote, what do they call themselves? Oh, white evangelical, which is not a theological term. There's no such stuff as a white evangelical. You're either an evangelical or you're not. And in the Bible, every time evangel, the Greek word evangel is used, it's always connected to justice and uplifting of the poor. Huh? But anytime an attorney general president will separate children, right, from their parent, from their mother, well, no, that's not the way to say that. Let's be real. Since we're Quakers today, and Quakers tell the truth, let's be serious. Separate brown children. Because you know in your heart, if those were black and brown border officers and ICE officers that were putting white children in cages, and why are they doing it? Because they don't see those children as human beings. They don't see them as full humanity. Just like when we did that to Indians, they didn't see them as full human. Or just like when they snatched black babies from the breast of their mothers and so, they didn't see them as human beings. And just like when we had the concentration camps for Japanese, there is this inhumanity of meanness that has come into our politics. Why is Puerto Rico still suffering? Because it's brown. We can't bypass that. But not only do we have the meanness of our politics, our Congress, our president, we have the misdirection of the media. I wish I could get in the room with some of these media executives. Now, I wouldn't do what Trump is doing, because we need the media. But I would just say to them, stop following these tweets every morning. We got the tweeter in charge. You know, every morning, you know, he engages in Trump pornography, and they just follow right behind it. The most underreported stories is racial voter suppression, poverty, how the corporations took the tax cuts, and rather than giving people a true raise and creating jobs, are buying their own stock. That's the only thing that's holding up the stock market right now, is they're buying their own stocks. The biggest story is how the courts are being filled with racial and radical judges, and how many people are dying because of the lack of health care. The goal is to misdirect the media. And that's the times we're living in. Not only do we have a meanness in our politics and a misdirection of the media, we also are seeing a misuse of the courts, just like in Ezekiel's day, just like in the day of Lucretia Mott and Coffin. See, in American history, the courts were always used to expand rights, never deny them. Of their 27 amendments to the Constitution, only one shrunk rights. Every other one expanded rights. Expanded rights. Over the last few weeks, we've seen 5 members, not 6, not 7, not 8, not 9, 5 members of the Supreme Court roll back the rights of gay people. They say people don't even have to sell somebody a cake because of their religious reason. Do they understand that some folk will claim that about other people? They claim segregation on religious terms. And I can tell you that Liz Theo Harris, my co-chair in the Poor People's Campaign, a wonderful, smart, brilliant woman, and 8 other people were arrested on the steps of the Supreme Court for praying. They were put in jail for 24 hours with arms behind their back for 5, and then they had leg arms, ankle chains, and hand chains with the chain that runs down to the ankle for 10 hours for praying on the steps of the Supreme Court. The same Supreme Court that just said they support religious freedom. And they were put in a jail with roaches and infestation for praying. This same court has just attacked union workers. This same court is rolling back voting rights. This same court is rolling back the rights of people seeking asylum and refugees and Muslims. This same court will have to make the decision on whether we will give the power to one, well, they just did the other day, the power to one man who can determine who comes in this country. And what's so ugly about that is if that old man's great-grandmama tried to come under the rules he's pushing, she wouldn't have been able to come here. And now there is an active conversation about changing the 14th Amendment. And does the 14th Amendment really mean what it says? We are seeing a misuse of the courts. We are seeing a meanness in politics. We are seeing a misdirection of the media, just like Lucretia Mott, just like Levi Coffin saw. And lastly, we are seeing the malpractice of theology in ways we haven't seen since slave master theology. When we see preachers who claim they follow Jesus sanctioning the denial of health care, that's theological malpractice. Because the Jesus I know, if he did anything, he set up free health clinics everywhere he went. And he never charged a leper a copay. When we see these preachers walking into the White House, they're not preaching the gospel of Jesus. They may say they're as whatever they call themselves, conservative, but they never represent Jesus when they sanction the mistreatment of children, or they're silent on the mistreatment of children, or they sanction the mistreatment of immigrants, or they sanction greedy corporations robbing the country through tax cuts. The Bible over and over again calls that sin. That's what Ezekiel said. When he said that robbery was rife, extortion was rife, hurting children and family and the poor was rife. The politicians that use power to hurt people, Ezekiel describes them as wolves. They have lost something in their humanity. Jim Crow was sinful. Slavery was sin. And what we see now is a boldness of the false prophets of this kind of covering up and being a puppet to the empire rather than being prophets to the empire. We're seeing the same way that Pharaoh had his false magicians. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees were the religious figures that sanctioned the crucifixion of Jesus. It's wrong and it's malpractice. Jesus said, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was an undocumented stranger, did you welcome me? Jesus said, I've come to bring good news to the poor. The patokos is the Greek word, those who've been made poor by economic exploitation. I've come to bring good news to the brokenhearted, the bruised, the battered, the captive. And then he said at the end, I've come to bring good news to the unaccepted. I've come to declare the year of Jubilee, the year of acceptance. And when you have a group of ministers that claim to be ministers, so bold that they will go in and pray, P-R-A-Y, for a president who is, and a Congress people who are praying, P-R-E-Y-I-N-G, on the poor and the hurting and the children, that is heresy. That is not the inner light, that is inner darkness. And there comes a time, like Lucretia Mott and Levi Coffin, we have to call it what it is. And not tiptoe around the roses about it. It is the abuse of faith. It is the malpractice of theology. It is wickedness in high places. And we have to call it what it is. And so, in the light of all of this, what's we do? We must be the moral witnesses in this moment. Like Ezekiel, like Lucretia Mott and Coffin, we must be a part of a collective outcry. That's the first thing. When God finally says speak, we must speak. We must be a part of a collective outcry that says every platform I have, I'm going to say something. We're not going to be silent anymore. That must be our first decision. After we've been silent enough to make sure it's not our own ego, to make sure it's not our own arrogance, and God has made it clear that somebody needs to talk about love, somebody needs to talk about justice, somebody needs to critique what's going on, then we must refuse to be silent anymore. Somebody's hurting our brothers. Somebody's hurting our sisters. Somebody's hurting the children. Somebody's hurting the weak and the worn out and the left out. And we must declare we won't be silent anymore. No. There comes a time we have to speak from that deep place that is inside of us. And then secondly, in this moment, the moral witness must include mass nonviolent cooperation and civil disobedience. We've had 40 days where over 4,000 people did civil disobedience, but that was the launch. I'm looking for the day when 100,000 people across this country will sit down in the middle of main streets across this country and say, we're not going to cooperate anymore with systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, this war economy, and the false moral narrative. We're not going to cooperate anymore when we see people's health care being taken and when we see the poor being abused. That's what Levi Coffin did. That's what Mark did. That's what Ezekiel did. They engaged in, the prophets always engaged in nonviolent cooperation. And why? Because something is at stake, my friend, more than a party right now. We're in the middle of the possibility of a third Reconstruction or a third deconstruction. America's been through two, the Reconstruction of the 1800s, and then the deconstruction of that by 1877, 1890, 96, the reconstruction of the civil rights movement, then the deconstruction of that through the killings and the death. And we're right now in the middle of the possibility of a third Reconstruction or a third deconstruction. We are not trying to save the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. The very heart and soul of this democracy is on the line right now. When the darkness of meanness in politics and misdirection of the media and misuse of the court and malpractice of theology all come together, that is no normal moment. That is no normal moment. There is a book on how democracies die. Let me read an excerpt from you and I'm through. It says, in other words, dictators do not always arrive at the head of columns of troops. When they seize the television station, they do not send in soldiers but party loyalists who promise to end fake news. They do not need to imprison judges. They just pack their courts and rewrite the Constitution to make opposition impossible. They win democratic election and then they dismantle democracy. Elected dictators have traits we should have learned after all this time to recognize in advance. They reject the conventions of democratic life. They will do anything to win power and tell any lie to retain it. They do not just want to beat their opponents, but destroy them, and with them the possibility of change. To justify their assaults, they use the language of civil war. When their supporters turn to violence, they approve with winks and nods. When their opponents criticize, they are not citizens exercising their democratic rights, but criminals spreading libel or treason, enemies of the people, to coin a phrase. Until the election, this is what the author said, and these are Harvard writers, until the election of Donald Trump, I might have been describing Orban or Putin, but now readers would have to, they said, we have to recognize that what we have seen happening in other countries is happening even more in those other countries because of what is happening now in America. I was in Liverpool, England recently, speaking to 131 nations. And while I was there, they let me know that Bannon had gone over to France and spoke to a group of people and told them to wear racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia as a badge of honor. And the other strong men and women that are rooted in neo-fascism and nationalism are being encouraged by what we see happening here. We have to have mass nonviolent cooperation and civil disobedience. We must have a mass collective outcry, and then we must have mass voter registration and voter mobilization. Oh yes, if Lucretia Mott fought for the right to vote, Quakers ought to use that right everywhere they can, right? You know, over 4 million Obama voters stayed home in 2016. That's 1.3, that's 1/3, that's 1.3 million voters just stayed home. And we got to tell folk, look, when you vote for folk, you're not trying to elect Jesus. He's already king, so you're not trying to. Do you know that what we're dealing with today came down to 78,000 votes in 3 states? Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Trump won Michigan by 10,000 votes out of 4.8 million cast. In Pennsylvania, he won Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes out of 6.2 million cast. That's what we're dealing with. We have to have massive voter mobilization and massive voter registration, and not even just to register more votes, but to get the folk that's already registered to stop giving up on this democracy, because you see what you get. Because they're not trying to win the popular vote. They're trying to win the electoral college. So every state is a battleground. Now, my grandmother, who I was telling Carolyn was a seer, she had a word for people that wouldn't vote, since people died for the right to vote and bled for the right to vote and suffered for the right to vote. She called them trifling. Not only must we have mass collective outcry. Let me act like I'm at my Pentecostal church. Touch your neighbor, Brother Quaker, and say mass collective outcry. Now touch the other neighbor and say mass nonviolent civil disobedience and non-cooperation. And now look behind you and say mass voter registration and voter mobilization. If we're going to walk like Ezekiel and walk like Mark and Coffee, we have to do something. We can't go somewhere and just cry, morning time is over. It's movement time now. It's movement time. And we must come together. It must be fusion. We must understand that the same forces that attack women attack the right to vote. And the same forces that attack the right to vote attack the gay and LGBT community. And the same forces that attack the LGBTQ community also attack environmental justice. And the same forces that attack environmental justice also attack union and labor rights. And the same folk that attack union and labor rights, they also attack public education. And the same people that attack public education are oftentimes bound up in this false moral narrative of religious extremism and religious nationalism. And if they are sinister enough to be together, we ought to be smart enough to come together. And it's time for us to link up. Our truth must come together. Our marching must come together. Our protests must come together. We must come together. Mass coming together. Mass nonviolent civil disobedience, mass voter registration and mobilization, mass collective outcry, and then finally, we must have mass moral commitment. Just like Ezekiel kept witnessing, even though the people were hard-hearted, even though the people were stiff-necked. In fact, God said they may not even listen to you, but I need you to keep speaking, because at least they'll know there was a prophet among them. And that he kept right on standing and kept right on witnessing, and no matter how long it took, he kept on until there was a meeting in the valley of dry bones. And the bones began to come together, and they rose up and became an army of hope. It was 15 chapters after chapter 22 that there was a movement, because Ezekiel kept standing in the gap, kept doing what the Lord said do. He didn't stop just because the first time he stood, there was no response. Same was true with Lucretia Mott and Levi Coffin. They didn't just go to one rally. They didn't just write one letter, send one tweet. Well, they didn't have tweets then, but they didn't just send one letter. They didn't just meet one time. They didn't just sit in a Quaker meeting one time. They didn't just make one speech. They had deep moral commitment, and we need mass moral commitment. A whole lot of folk that are committed until they had their commitment in the face of bad court decision. They had their commitment in the face of death. They had their commitment in the face of mean people, and we need that now. We need that now. One more time, turn to your neighbor and say, neighbor, are you committed? Ask them, do you believe that you're alive to make a difference now and to work on saving the heart and soul of this democracy? My brothers, I believe I believe I was crippled from 1993 to 2005. The Lord blessed me to be able to walk. They said I'd never walk again. I believe I'm walking again because God's trusting that if I walk, I might walk for somebody. I might stand for somebody. I might fight for justice. God wants commitment. I was somewhere and they told me, you'll be dead by Christmas. That was 4 years ago and I'm still here. We cannot expect microwave transformation. We have been called to this moment right now. Let us not expect easy and quick fixes. It's not just getting rid of Trump. It's getting rid of the attitudes that will pull this nation down into the darkness of injustice. Let us join the spirit of Langston Hughes. When Langston Hughes said in 1935, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath that America will be. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot, graft and stealth and lies, we the people must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plains, and all the stretch of these great green states, and we must make America, America again. And so, my Quaker friends, I believe that we are being called. And those of us who feel the burden are going to have to know what you know in your spiritual formation. And that is that light is the only way to transform darkness. And you've got to find a way so that the inner light comes out and shines light in the whole world. Light in the dark gaps of racism. Light in the dark gaps of poverty. Light in the dark gaps of hatred and injustice. This is a moral movement that requires no matter what forces of injustice do, we've got to hold up the light of truth. Is there anybody planning on holding it up? We've got to hold up the light of justice. In fact, Fannie Lou Hamer said we might as well sing while we march. We might as well sing while we go to jail. We might as well sing while we refuse to cooperate. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. No matter what Trump does, this little light of mine. No matter what the Congress does, this little light of mine. No matter what the courts do, this little light of mine. I'm going to let it shine until the poor are lifted. I'm going to let it shine until everybody has a living wage. I'm going to let it shine until we get guaranteed income. I'm going to let it shine until we have health care for everybody. I'm going to let it shine until we have housing for everybody. I'm going to let it shine until we have clean water and clean land and clean air. I'm going to let it shine. I'm going to let it shine. I'm going to let it shine until we fight poverty with everything we have. I'm going to let it shine until we stop putting so much money in war and stop putting money in the war against poverty. I'm going to let it shine. I just need to holler like I do when I'm at home at my Pentecostal church. Is there anybody that's got some light in them? Is there anybody that's got some light in them? I'm telling you, from the divine, I heard him when he said it in silence. This is the time for you to let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Everywhere you go, let it shine.